I often wonder just how many times my family went from Indiana to Washington, D.C. during the years I lived at home. I was told that the first time I went with my mother and dad to visit my dad's 3 half-brothers out east was when I wasn't even a year old. We made the trip back and forth frequently, sometimes twice a year. By the time I was in grade school, the nuns would agree to let me take a week off to travel to Washington. I knew they felt that travel, especially to the nation's capital, was educational, but I think they wanted me to go so they could have a vacation. When I got older, I began to wonder how my dad, a lowly plumbing salesman for the local Montgomery Ward store, could have afforded all those trips. Back before the interstates, we spent a total of 6 days on the road just to get to Washington, D.C. from Washington, Indiana, and back. Just think of all the motel and restaurant costs. Years later, I learned that one of my dad's half-brothers, the one we visit the most often, sent my dad money to help pay for the trips. Those 6 days in the car provided some of the most important bonding between me and my parents. We were each other's captive audience. Some of the most precious memories of my childhood are memories of those frequent trips. By the time I was in the 5th grade, I had become my dad's official navigator. I sat in the front seat, maps in hand, giving my dad directions. In retrospect, I realize now that my dad could have traveled those 750 miles each way without any instructions at all. He likely had the route memorized, but my dad nurtured my love of maps and of map making. Sometimes he pretended to be lost so I could help him find the way. Day one took us only across southern and central eastern Indiana to Richmond, a sleepy college town famous for its block upon block of magnificent tree-lined streets. We spent the night with a great-aunt and uncle. My Aunt Ag was my grandmother's sister. I remember when I was about 8 coming to grips with the fact that Ag was short for Agatha. I loved the name Ag, but thought that Agatha was a horrible name. It didn't fit Aunt Ag, who I thought was a wonderful woman. Aunt Ag's husband was named Tom. Because I loved maps so much, I couldn't wait for our visits with Ag and Tom. The reason was that out in their spacious backyard was a cozy concrete block building. It was Great Uncle Tom's office. You see, he was a draftsman. I never fully understood what his projects were, but I remember that the very well-lighted office was ankle-deep in tossed-about drawings and blueprints. I thought Great Uncle Tom was a lucky guy. After all, he was the only adult I knew who had an incredibly messy room and got paid for it. And as far as I know, Aunt Ag never complained. There were 3 different drawing tables in the building. They were large work surfaces made of tan-colored wood. The tops tilted to give a better view of what was being worked on. On one of our trips, Great Uncle Tom must have been between assignments. I say that because he spent over 3 hours with me, sitting at one of his drafting tables just talking. He knew I loved maps and wanted to be eventually a cartographer, a map maker. He got a huge sheet of paper and put it on the table, tilted much more than usual so I could get a better view. He handed me a soft-leaded pencil and asked me to draw him a map. I realized that I knew my old neighborhood back in Washington, Indiana pretty well, so I set about making a map of the area around my parents' home. I put in every house I could remember, and the street names, and even the big parking lot of the nearby grocery store. When I was finished, he looked at me and said, "Kiddo, I need to teach you something called scale." By the way, I should point out that I loved being called Kiddo. Although my family called me Denny, all of my teachers and friends called me Dennis. I always thought that I was more of a Denny than a Dennis. Kiddo wasn't quite Denny, but it was a heck of a lot more friendly than Dennis. After I finished the map, Tom spent about an hour giving me the first really important set of instructions that I would use the rest of my life in making maps. He taught me about scale. You see, scale is a term used to explain the relationship between a map's features and real life. It's often expressed as a ratio. For example, 1 inch on a map might represent 1 mile. And Tom explained to me that scale is a constant thing. Over and over he told me that scale was everything when it came to making maps. He pointed out that in the area around my parents' house, the city blocks were larger than near the fringes of the map. I explained that I knew more about that area and needed the room to put in all the houses and buildings I could remember. That answer didn't satisfy Tom. He told me that if 1 inch, for example, represented 100 feet on one side of the map, then 1 inch needed to represent 100 feet on every part of the map. Remember, kiddo, he said again, scale is everything. What Uncle Tom was giving me was a lesson in consistency. Later in life, when I learned what a draftsman did, I realized under what very strict rules Tom had to work. He had to be consistent, and he wanted me to be that way too. Eventually, when I became a journalist, that lesson really hit home. Just as if I were drawing a map, writing a news story demands consistency. The company for which I worked most of my life, UPI, United Press International, had a 300-page book that told every employee in every corner of the world how to write and use phrases and punctuation, so we all could be consistent. We all had to put out a consistent product. Before that evening in Uncle Tom's drafting building was over, he asked me to go to the car and get some of my many highway maps. I didn't have to ask Dad for the key. Back in those days, we left the car unlocked. I returned with some maps and took out one of Indiana. Tom spread it out on one of the other drafting tables. He pointed to a little notation near the left bottom corner. You see, he pointed out, on this map, 1 inch represents 15 miles. Then he showed me something else. Lifting up an Ohio map I had brought with me, he noted that on that map, 1 inch represented only 12 miles. Suddenly, I had another one of those childhood moments that seems as though it happened this week and not more than 50 years ago. Since my aunts and uncles over the years had brought me so many highway maps that they had gotten free from gas stations, I didn't worry about marking on some or even cutting them up. Once I had cut the right side off of an Indiana map and on the left side of an Ohio map. I wanted to join them together to make one big two-state map. But when I joined the two-state maps side by side, nothing lined up. The reason was that each was drawn to a different scale. That night I went to bed with a new set of facts to ponder while I was trying to get to sleep. I said to myself, scale is why H.O. gauge model trains run on everyone's tracks, whether in Indiana or India. Scale is why my dad can have his tires rotated and the left front will fit on the back rear. They're all the same size. The next morning, Aunt Ag made breakfast. She had a wonderful habit of mixing 2 kinds of cereal together. I love Cheerios mixed with Wheaties. I covered the cereal with something my dad had introduced me to called half and half. For a tall man, my dad was a wimp when it came to coffee. He put so much half and half and sugar in his cup, his coffee was the color of sand. On the other hand, my mom, who was only 4'10", drank hers jet black. During breakfast, I mentioned to Uncle Tom how much I appreciated his lesson about scale. He smiled, and with a twinkle in his eye, he said, "Kiddo, there's another word you need to learn, standardization. It's what makes the world work." After breakfast, we headed out on our trek again, headed east, headed to Washington, D.C. 2 more days of bonding with my parents lay ahead, then 3 on the way back. All the way I sat up front with Dad using my maps, all drawn to scale to keep him from getting lost. 4 decades later, while working as a travel writer, I spent a day in Richmond and interviewed the head of the Chamber of Commerce about the city's history and its importance on the old National Road, the nation's first federally financed interstate highway. I couldn't remember Ag and Tom's address, but I did know their last name. The Chamber of Commerce lady found their address in an old city directory in her library. We drove down the alley behind the house where we always spent the night on our way back and forth to the East Coast. There, in the backyard, was that old concrete block office where I spent hours learning about drafting and drawing. I looked at it as long as I could stand it. The flood of memories was intoxicating, and in some ways, considering the passage of time, too melancholy for me to handle. As I stood there looking back into the past, I had the urge to walk over to the door and knock, hoping I would hear a voice saying, "Hey, kiddo, come in, and bring your maps."